let's continue on looking at muscle. And now we're going to be looking mostly at skeletal muscle because skeletal muscle is kind of the dominant muscle tissue type in our body. So we're really going to just focus on that. We're going to look at the basic features of skeletal muscle and look at the involvement of nerves and blood vessels with our skeletal muscle tissue, and specifically look at a place where our nervous system meets up with our muscular system. It's called the neuromuscular junction or synapse, or also called the motor end plate. So we're going to zoom in at this place where these two different organ systems come together. And then we'll talk a little bit about different ways that muscles are attached to our body parts. Okay, so first, I want to point out that with skeletal muscle, every single muscle in our body is actually considered an organ. And that is because if we remember the definition of an organ is when we have two or more tissue types that are working together towards a common function, okay? And so as we're seeing here, right, there are a bunch of different, 3 different tissue types, 3 out of 4 of the tissue types, and we can even count the 4th epithelial tissue, the lining of the blood vessels kind of on the surface of it that are supplying our raw muscles. So 3 out of 4 of the main tissue types are associated, 4 out of 4 are associated with muscle. First of all, muscle itself, right? And then there's connective tissue. We're going to learn about specific types of connective tissue that wrap outside the surface of our muscles and even help to organize muscle fibers inside. So we'll talk about that. And then of course there's tendons and flat tendons called aponeuroses that become continuous with our muscle tissue and help to attach our muscle to our body to provide movement. For example, attaching to our bones in order to pull on those bones to provide movement. And then we're going to see that blood vessels are intimately organized. As I said, that that our muscular system requires a lot of blood. And at rest, about a little over a liter of blood per minute is supplied to our skeletal muscle system. And when you exercise, that blood supply increases up to about 11.6 liters per minute. And so our muscles need a lot of blood in order to function. They're very, very needy for glucose and oxygen that is being supplied in that blood. And so we're going to see how the blood vessels are very intimately associated with our muscle cells, okay? All right, so kind of the basics first here is let's talk about the connective tissue. So if each muscle is made up of these different types of tissues, we're going to first look at the connective tissue that is involved with organizing muscle, okay? And so what we have are these what are called mysiums, and they are wrappings of connective tissue around skeletal muscle, around every single skeletal muscle in our body. And so the first one is called epimysium. And hopefully we recall that epi means on top or above. Okay, so this means above or on top of the muscle. And so that tells us it's this dense, irregular CT, very fibrous sheath of connective tissue that surrounds an entire muscle. Okay, so it's wrapping on the very outside of a muscle, okay? And what's kind of neat is that on its outer surface, it sort of grades into and becomes one with, I'm gonna write blends with, this other type of connective tissue I'll write about called fascia. Oopsies, spelled that wrong, sorry. fascia, sorry. Okay, and it blends, the fibers of this epimysium blend with the collagen fibers of the fascia. And then we're gonna see on the inner surface of the epimysium that it then projects in between these bundles of muscle fiber cells to form this middle layer called the perimysium. Okay, so the inner surface of it projects kind of between, and I'm going to define this stuff for you, fascicles to form this next mysium, this next wrapping called the perimysium. So perimysium is this more middle wrapping of connective tissue, and it's a thicker connective tissue, and it is a dense, irregular connective tissue, but it is a thicker connective tissue wrapping compared to the epimysium. And what it does is it is surrounding these little bundles of muscle fibers that are called fascicles. Okay, and in fact, fascicles are the grain that you see in a cut of meat, okay? So you can see them with your naked eye. Okay, you can see them with your naked eye. And we're gonna also see that within the perimysium that there are blood vessels and nerves that are also within the perimysium and surrounding it. Okay, and then that leads us to the innermost connective tissue wrapping involved with muscle tissue, and that is the endomysium. Okay, sorry, peri, hopefully you caught that. That's perimeter around. Okay, perimeter, the outside perimeter. Endomysium. Endo means within, right? Inner. And so this is a loose areolar CT. Okay, that is surrounding individual skeletal muscle fibers. Okay, and it's a really, oops, shoot, what just happened there? Sorry about that. It's a really thin sleeve on the outside surface of the cell of the muscle fiber cell. And what's cool is that it is really providing this kind of extracellular environment that's needed okay, for the muscle fiber cell and its associated nerve ending. We're going to see that the nerve ending is going to be coming right, penetrating through and coming almost in contact to the surface of the muscle fiber cell. Okay, and so this picture really nicely shows the organization of muscles and where these connective tissue wrappings live and what am I talking about with these fascicles and things, right? So here we're looking at a beautiful forearm muscle, and we're going to be learning about this is an extensor muscle that we're going to be learning in the lab side of things. Okay, and so we're looking at just kind of one of these guys, and so this entire piece here, this entire thing, right, is the muscle itself. And we can see at the end of it is a tendon tissue, that dense regular connective tissue. that is attaching it to a bone there. Okay, so then this outer wrapping that we see on this outside surface, right, that's kind of peeled back here, is the epimysium, right? So it's a very outer wrapping. We peel it back and we can see inside there's all these little bundles, okay, right? These little circular bundles. And so one of these circular bundles, these are all the fascicles. And so one fascicle has been pulled out of this particular illustration to show you kind of how the fascicle is oriented. And then what we see that's pulled out of here is an individual muscle fiber cell. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of muscle fibers that are all bundled together. Okay, and just one of those muscle cells, fiber cells, has been pulled out. Now between the fascicles, you can kind of think of this like connective tissue glue substance, and we can see there's blood vessels and nerves. That's the perimysium. So if we look at this cross section up here, right, these individual bundles, right, would be individual fascicles, okay? And then if you look closely kind of at the, I don't know, light purplish, pinkish, I don't know, I think it's kind of purpley, but that light purpley stuff that lives in between, right, in between, and we see that it surrounds blood vessels and nerves, right, that is the perimysium. Okay. And then pulling out an individual muscle cell, okay, so then surrounding the surrounding the surface, right, is the endomysium. Okay, surrounding the surface is the endomysium there. Okay, now again, we can see that there are blood vessels, and we see that as a red tube and a blue tube. So that's representing arteries and veins we'll learn about. And then there are nerves that are embedded within the perimysium, right? Okay, so each skeletal muscle and each of these muscle cells that make up a muscle has its own blood supply and has nerve endings associated with it. So there are nerves and there are small blood vessels that are called capillaries that are associated with our muscle fiber cells, okay? And in fact, the blood vessels, the small capillaries actually travel through the endomysium to reach every single muscle fiber. Okay, and I'm going to show you a picture of that. So these nerves and blood vessels, they branch repeatedly to get really super tiny, and they branch through the perimysium and enter into the endomysium tissue. So they branch through the perimysium, they're through this purple stuff, they get smaller and smaller, okay? And then they branch in to the endomysium to reach these individual muscle fibers that are shown within the inside these vesicles. Okay, so they penetrate all the way through to get to the individual muscle fiber. Okay. Now we're going to see that the smallest nerve branches, the very end branches, and they're called axon terminals, will serve individual muscle fiber cells. And then the smallest blood vessels, aka capillaries, will surround each muscle fiber cell. And I'm going to show you pictures of this, okay? Okay. So again, why? Because remember, these cells, this tissue, super needy for blood, super needy for oxygen and glucose. And then every single muscle fiber has to be able to be stimulated electrically by our nerve endings, by our nerves. And so every single muscle fiber has to be hooked up to that electrical cabling in order to receive that signal to contract, right? Okay, so how is it that our nervous system tells our muscles to contract? With skeletal muscle tissue, there is a place where our nervous system meets up with our muscular system, with our skeletal muscles. And this is called the neuromuscular synapse, also called the neuromuscular junction, and it's also called the motor end plate. I'm sorry, there are so many names for this thing, but all of these names mean the same exact thing, okay? And so that's what we're looking at. We see that it's the motor neuron, as we see right here with its axon that's carrying the electrical signal that's traveling down the axon, right? And then we see, whoa, look at all these freaking branches, right? So all of this branches. So the motor neuron's axon branches a bunch of times into tinier and tinier little pieces, okay, till it finally penetrating through the paramecium, right? And then through, right? So we said through the paramecium and then to enter the endomysium to serve an individual muscle fiber cell. And so that's what we see here. We see one muscle fiber, okay, that is hooked up to this motor neuron's axon. And so at the very end of it, we call it the axon terminal. Let's do a few other definitions here. The place where, again, where these two meet up is called the motor end plate. Okay, and then muscle fiber has a unique type of plasma membrane that's different from other cell types. And so it has its own name. I'm sorry. But the sarcolemma is basically the plasma membrane of a muscle fiber cell. Okay, again, sarco means flesh. And then we're gonna see these myofibrils. So this is where it's gonna start feeling really confusing for you, that you've entered this weird, like Russian doll thing of all these tiny little long fiber tubes inside, tubes that are inside tubes that are inside tubes, right? Okay, so it's gonna be really important that you try to get this straight, that this one whole tube is a muscle fiber cell, okay? And this is a skeletal one. How do I know? Because I see all these nuclei, right? Okay, but what we see within the sarcoplasm, which is the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber cell, is we see these bundles of protein filaments that are called myofibrils. So these are bundles of myofilaments, right, which are these myosin, right? If you remember myosin and actin protein filaments. Okay, that are inside the sarcoplasm. Okay, and a cell can have anywhere from a few dozen of these myofibrils to over 1,000 of these myofibrils within an individual muscle cell. Okay. Okay. How we doing? Hopefully we're doing okay. All right. So then, Now, if we zoom in at the place, this is what we're doing here. We're zooming in at this particular spot. Okay, this box, we're going to zoom in at this place where the very end of the axon, what we're calling the axon terminal, the very end of the nerve ending, is coming almost touching. It's coming and creating this junction, this synapse between itself and the surface of the muscle fiber cell. Okay, and so that's what we're zooming in on here. Okay, so we're seeing this is the synaptic or axon terminal. It's the very end of the nerve ending, right? We saw that axon branched a whole bunch of times, right? So this is the very end of it. So like, just like when you go to the airport, right? You walk forever and you take, you know, even trolleys and stuff to finally get to your terminal, right? At the very end. Same thing here. This is where the electrical signal finally gets to the very end of all the branching, okay? And so what we see is that this axon terminal, a synaptic terminal, is lying kind of on the surface, and it's almost touching, but not quite. It's almost touching. It's within the endomysium, okay? It's within this loose connective tissue environment, okay? And so within, now we're gonna zoom in, we're zooming in, whoopsies. We're zooming in on this special spot right here, okay, to look here. All right, so now what's happening, remember, let's kind of go back for a second here. What's happening? The electrical signal that's fired from this motor neuron is traveling down, right? It's traveling down this axon, and then it's going to travel, right? Just like you traveling to the airport to get to your terminal, traveling all the way to the very end to get to this axon terminal. Okay, and so at the end of the terminal, waiting to get the signal to go, are these vesicles called synaptic vesicles that contain a neurotransmitter. And this is a specific neurotransmitter for skeletal muscle contraction. It's called acetylcholine or acetylcholine. Some people pronounce it. We can abbreviate it ACH, okay? So that's what these little red balls are here within these synaptic vesicles, right? We see a whole bunch of molecules of acetylcholine all ready to go. So what happens is the electrical signal is received at the end of this axon terminal, okay? And that signals for the acetylcholine to be exocytosed out of the cell, out of the neuronal cell, out of the motor neuron cell, okay? And to go across this little gap, see here, this little gap here that we see here kind of in brown, okay? That is called the synaptic cleft. The synaptic cleft. Okay, so the acetylcholine is exocytosed out of the motor neuron and travels across the synaptic cleft between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber cell. And then the acetylcholine binds to its receptor called the acetylcholine receptor, on the surface of the muscle fiber cell. Okay, so our muscle fibers, this is the signal that they receive from our nervous system. They receive acetylcholine. Our skeletal muscle cells receive acetylcholine, okay? And what that does is that causes the muscle fiber to generate its own action potential, to generate its own electrical signal. Okay, and it's at the cell surface that that happens. Okay. And then what we're gonna see is that signal is gonna travel across the surface and it's gonna go into the muscle fiber cell. And that signal now is a signal that's gonna travel deep into the core of the muscle fiber to tell the filaments, the protein filaments, to do their thing to cause shortening of the muscle fiber cell. So we're gonna get into all that. I do want to point out too that there is an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase that will chop up the acetylcholine so that our muscle contraction will stop. We don't want to be in a constant state of contraction all the time, right? We contract and then we relax, right? And so we have this enzyme that floats around that's produced by the muscle cell to turn off the signal for contraction. Okay, this is where I'm gonna stop. Oops. All right, we'll see ya. If I can figure out how to turn this damn thing off here. All right, we'll see you.